Welcome. I'm Rob Wolcott, a professor of innovation at Northwestern University, and I'm here today in Copenhagen, Denmark, in what used to be a cement silo. It's been renovated in a really extraordinary part of town, bringing together industry and green energy. The horizon is covered with windmills, all the things we associate with Denmark, and a beautiful part of town. And I'm pleased to be joined by Lone Frank, who is one of Denmark and I dare say Europe's top science journalists. Lone, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about what's on your mind these days. What's most interesting to you? What's bothering you today?
What's pretty much always been on my mind is understanding human nature. I mean, my background is in biology and neurobiology. I've always been really interested in who we are, understanding why we are the way we are. And of course that centers on, our brain. I've been interested in neurobiology, and I'm sort of becoming very interested.
And that was your academic heritage, right?
Yes, I have a PhD in neurobiology. I left the field many years ago in the mid-90s, and I've been a journalist ever since. And I've done, print, I've done radio, I've done television, and so on and so forth.
Well, I'm interested, what precipitated the move? I mean, neurobiology at the time was an emerging space. It's obviously there's a lot that's been accomplished since then, and it's wide open. You were in the middle of it. What precipitated the move?
I got really tired of killing rats and taking out their brains and growing their brain cells. It was basically the hands-on science that I found out, well, this is not really for me. I'm not patient enough, and there are tons of really good scientists out there. But I thought, well, there aren't that many that are really good at perhaps, thinking about what science means and trying to discuss that with the public. Why not try that?
And you mentioned you've always been interested in human nature and understanding why people do what they do and how they do it. Was that in your head when you decided to go into neuroscience, into neurobiology? That was your meta objective going into neurobiology?
It was. I mean, I have this interest from way back. I remember when I was maybe 3 or 4, my mother was a psychiatric nurse at a mental institution, and I, came with her sometimes. I met these insane people.
Right.
This was back
That's
in
a technical
the 60s.
term, correct?
Yeah,
yes,
back in the 60s and 70s. And I was deeply fascinated. I mean, with how different they were from me, and where does that come from, and how do we understand that people can be so different and act in so strange and bizarre ways sometimes, and what is going on in there. So that was the spark. And then through high school,
when you were
I just,
3 or 4 years old, you had that recognition.
Yeah.
What do you do with that when you're 4? Do you remember?
I remember discussing an awful lot with my parents. I mean, asking about, why are these people, why did they do this, why do they do that? I remember when I was, a little older, I, could read, I would read my mother's books about, mental health and stuff. Not that I would understand very much of it, but I was just intensely interested.
So you were one of those kids who just kept asking. Well, Lone, I'm pleased to say I have 2 daughters, Jolie and Sage, and they ask a lot of questions as well.
Yeah.
So you decided to go into science. You go through the whole process, and it is quite a process.
It is.
You decide that you're still excited about the objective of science and the insight that science provides, but the lifestyle maybe wasn't for you.
What I thought was, in fact, that, it's interesting to be in science, but you get very narrow in your focus. Well, you fiddle around with tiny little problems that you can spend decades on, basically. And I realized that my real interest in science is how the knowledge that we get out of the labs are in fact influencing our culture and the way that we think. That's the big sort of metaplane that I'm really interested in. So I thought, well, go and write about things, go and think about them.
So was journalism what first came to mind, or you just started thinking and writing and said, maybe I should share this, and it evolved?
as I was doing my PhD, actually at a company in Westchester, outside of New York,
Oh, right.
I sat there in the lab secretly writing little articles for Danish media and sent them home. People were thinking I was writing, real stuff.
So you were an
like PhD
undercover
report.
science writer.
I was. And so when I got back from doing my PhD, I had written stuff for papers here, and I basically just started writing more and sending it out, getting a place at a paper here and doing all sorts of freelance things as well. So.
There is something about trying, I think you and I have a similarity in the sense that we like to go big, broad in terms of thinking, but then we also recognize there needs to be some rigor in there somewhere.
Sure.
There needs to be some validation, or if not, you have to point it out and say, this is a flight of fancy. And so how do you go about finding what you're going to focus on? Because your meta question of understanding why humans do what humans do, understanding human nature, that's a question that's been open for a very long time.
It is.
So how do you go about selecting a space to work in?
Well, what you can do is you can tackle it from various angles, right? I work at a newspaper where I'm not obligated.
Weekend newspaper.
Yeah.
One of the for our foreign viewers, U.S. viewers, it would be sort of like the Atlantic or the New Yorker, that sort of publication.
Yeah. So I'm not under an obligation to focus on news stories at all. We're published once a week, and so what I do is really I think about what are the questions that interest me, and what can I dig something out that would interest people out there. So rather than following the news and going to report from a lab, they have found another anti-cancer drug, blah blah blah. That doesn't interest me very much. But I'd rather sit down and, for example, for this week, what I've done is I've been thinking about how do we think about trauma, and how do we go about treating trauma, and is there, in fact, a wrong kind of approach in that we, in the Western culture, think that trauma should be dealt with by talking? We should share things, and that's the way to heal. And there's this whole PTSD thinking. And then I go and look at the actual science, and there's a lot of science that points to the fact that, repressing stuff and using avoidant coping is often a better way to do it. And so I go into research on former child soldiers in Uganda, and research done by George Bonanno in the U.S. about trauma, PTSD, and how we are in fact much more resilient than our culture makes us think that we are.
So how did you discover this topic of the thousands of topics that you could have pursued? How did you discover this one?
It's often coincidental. I hear about this Danish researcher who has just done an anthropological study on these Ugandan child soldiers, and I'm flabbergasted by how they don't talk about their experiences. They have been through the most awful experience you can imagine, and they don't think about it. They don't talk about it. They, have a cultural way of leaving it in the past and actually living okay lives. A lot of them have no signs of PTSD. And so from that result, I dig into what do we know about trauma and traumatology, and what does the, what are the interests in the field? A lot of psychologists who would like to, basically make money and get research grants on the basis of treating trauma and making people more resilient. And actually what you find is that people are extremely
already
resilient. So there's an awful lot of wasted money out there.
But don't these things move as a pendulum? They swing a little too far one way and then maybe they come back the other direction. It seems like life is about a lot of polarity, about a lot of balance.
Yeah, and that's often what I try to deal with in stories is, look at the historical context. How has a field evolved, for example, and where are we now? Are we on the verge of going in a different direction, or are we out here, and should we be coming back? So definitely that's always something to keep in mind.
So you bring history into the picture.
Yeah, if I can.
Where did that come from? Because that's a topic of great interest to me, and I don't think we use history enough.
We don't. I mean, we don't have enough historical memory. It's like journalists can take up the exact same topic, every 5 years and do the same kinds of stories, and nobody remembers.
Well, that's a scaling methodology.
It is.
It pays the
but
bill.
it's again, I think we live so much in the here and now and in the future. I mean, we're in fact...
What do you mean we live in the future? What does that mean?
We think an awful lot about where are we going, what will the future be like? Instead of... We all say that, we can learn from the past, but do we ever? I mean, it doesn't seem that we do.
So what is your research telling you? Do you have good examples of humans learning from the past? And if so, what can we learn from what they learned?
I don't really have any good examples of learning from the past. I mean, it's not usually a one-to-one situation. We have seen this exact same thing before, so now we do this.
The past rhymes, in other words.
But there's always a lot of intellectual debate about we should remember this history or that history, but it never sort of percolates down from the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and so on to actual policy. I think.
Well, we shouldn't digress too far, but I am happy to say I think as someone with a background in economics, we did handle the economic crisis, which was our own doing, of course, but we did handle it very differently this time than we did in the 1930s. So maybe there's a little bit
you could say that
we've learned.
But then I would ask you, I mean, do you not think that we're on the same course?
We're on a different version. And there's the pendulum mechanism of markets.
And there's the boom and bust.
Dance while the music's playing, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So what about philosophy? You bring, what I've read of your work, you bring a lot of liberal arts in. I would assume that you're a fan of STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, but maybe also STEAM. Throw art in, and then liberal arts, humanities. You use a lot of that in your work.
Yeah.
What role does philosophy play in your perspective?
Well, philosophy is basically thinking, right? And there's good philosophy that sound thinking that has some kind of empirical background. There's a lot of philosophy that has absolutely no empirical background, and it not. You can't say that because a famous philosopher, old dead white man from Europe, thought something and said something. It must be true. I mean, I hate people who just throw philosophy quotes out there and then it's like kind of end of discussion.
Let it sit there.
Well, I mean, what does the empirical stuff say?
Yeah.
But of course, I mean, thinking is basically just tremendously important, and having a framework of thought to go from and to discuss from is absolutely, centrally important, I think, for science.
Do you have a philosophical system that you prefer?
I can't say so, but I admire people like Daniel Dennett, for example.
Yeah.
There are things you can go back to good old Immanuel Kant and say that there's a kernel here that's good.
Right.
Kierkegaard, I mean, and
Here we
the
are in
existentialism,
Denmark.
and I mean, there are interesting thoughts out there.
I was just thinking about Kierkegaard. In fact, on the plane here, I was watching the movie The Circle. I don't know if you've seen it. I'm a fan of science fiction, but I try my best to not let it get in the way of actual science.
Yeah.
But The Circle, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about a scenario where a Google, Facebook sort of company.
So it's a Dave Eggers book.
Promulgating this notion of. You read the book, great.
Yeah.
So you have more insight than I certainly do. But I thought of Kierkegaard while I was reading or watching that, because he said in various ways, live your life as if God is watching. Yeah. So now, in a sense, we have the possibility that somebody's watching all the time. Likely not God.
Right.
But
I don't believe there is one, so probably.
Well, that's another discussion.
Yeah.
So what about what we're learning about the brain, about neuroscience, says about how our perspective of ourselves and each other might change the rest of the century?
Well, what I would say about that whole topic, I mean, we are still scratching the surface of, trying to understand the brain. If you talk to neurologists, talk to neuroscientists, they will tell you that, we actually don't know very much. It might seem to the lay public from all they read in the papers that we know an awful lot, but it's actually not very much. But just getting, deeper and deeper insight into our own mechanics, so to speak, how we function. I mean, I think that is one of those, you could call them scientific revolutions, where we get from one look at ourselves to another. I mean, I think we are on the way to, not talking about a soul anymore, or even
well,
a
this is
self,
a Cartesian
or,
dualism, and
yes.
we've vanquished that multiple times, but it
it
continues
really
to come
comes back all
Yeah.
the time. But I think that deeper and deeper insight into the brain, how it works and why it works, and combining that with evolutionary understanding of how it evolved and why, will sort of change our view of ourselves to, you could call it a radical biological view of yourself.
Lorna, what's science saying to us about what the self actually is? So one of my colleagues at Kellogg, he was at Caltech, and he has a lab in New York, Mohan Surf, he explains that there are multiple selves inside, perhaps, fighting for dominance at any given time or playing different roles. Yeah. So is it incorrect to believe that we have one self and we're in control?
I absolutely believe that is incorrect.
So how do you answer this question? What does it feel like to you?
I think it's very obvious from all sorts of neuroscience that we don't have one self. Neuroscience is dismantling the old notion of there is a core self in there, a little homunculus that's sort of in charge. Yeah. No, there isn't. There is the state of your brain, or rather the states of your brain, and you are different people, in fact, depending on what you do to yourself. And at one given moment, I mean, yes, we have what we feel is the conscious self, but that's made up of an awful lot of stuff that goes on in the subconscious or the unconscious. And something is, put up there on the conscious level. We don't know what's going on back there and why this is coming up, not, another self, if you would. And I think the Thomas Metzinger, for example, the German philosopher, has, he's written a lot about how we in fact are selfless. It's an illusion that the brain
creates. When you
creates.
say selfless in Metzinger's perspective, you mean we do not have an identifiable, isolatable self?
No.
So if neuroscience is dismantling the notion, the traditional notion of a self, do we have an indication what's going to take its place? Is it still too early?
I think, it won't change anything on the subjective side of things. We will still feel that we have this self and that we are in control. We don't feel the unconscious, but we will know probably more about the brain processes that bring about this feeling of the self. So it's a way of, we are in fact, with a lot of neuroscience, what we're getting is, another kind of superego. We will know more about who we are, and we will sort of see the strings of
Geppetto up top.
Yeah,
doing the,
yeah.
So if neuroscience is, in a sense, obliterating the self, and we recognize that we're a set of systems that has a subjective experience, there's another wrinkle coming, and that's cybernetics.
Yeah.
That's artificial intelligence, other sorts of cognitive enhancements, sensory enhancements. What are you seeing on the horizon there? What's important to you?
Well, I think if you look at, and I'm in my latest book that will come out later, I have a look at deep brain stimulation, which is this, wonderful technology that we talk about in connection with typically dystonia or Parkinsonism. That you put in little electrodes in circuits of the brain where something is wrong, and you correct the wrong, whatever it is, and you have a normally functioning human being. And of course, this technology is now it's spreading into psychiatry, because if whatever is wrong in there, whatever you think needs to be corrected, you can correct much better with electrodes than with, say, pharmaceuticals that work all over the brain. This is very precise, right? And
the specificity
is much greater. Yeah.
Very difficult with pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, and what you see is that this works very well, apparently, with depression, anorexia, OCD, Tourette syndrome, all sorts of stuff. And you can, in fact, imagining correcting anything, and not just correcting, you could enhance things. Of course you can, because what you see is really that when you try to treat people for eating disorders, for example, you hit places in the brain where suddenly their memories become much more efficient and much more vivid. So, there's all sorts of potential here. And this is
but
still
it's a long
just
path, because the brain is such a complex organism.
It is.
You're never sure the unintended consequences of the manipulations that you might affect.
And we're in the infancy of this, but still, I mean, I think it's pretty clear from just the very crude technology that we have now, and the ones that we have on the horizon, where you have, many more electrodes, and that can not just stimulate the brain, but read the brain in real time and stimulate it before you even, have the thoughts or the behavior that you were otherwise going to have.
So it sounds like we're becoming far better at figuring out how to make these things happen.
Yeah.
But then the question becomes, what should we make happen and why?
Sure.
How do we address that? That sounds like a job for a science journalist.
It does. It does. That's why I'm writing books about this stuff. And it is really, really interesting, because there is this hype around the technology right now. And, you cure diseases, or you certainly, you help people with diseases. On the horizon, you could say, well, why not just continue? Why should neurosurgeons not go in the direction that plastic surgeons did, from treating disease to just
elective.
making people look better, and for neurosurgeons, making people think better, feel better, whatever it is. And a lot of neurosurgeons, it's actually been a poll among neurosurgeons in the US, and I think it was half of them said there's no ethical problem with that. So, and there will certainly be a demand.
Yes.
I mean, I would take an enhanced memory if I could have one, definitely.
Well, I think Marx once said that late capitalist society is defined by vanity, and perhaps he was right.
I think human culture is defined by vanity, in fact.
Right. So figuring out how to do things, and then figuring out, it's a parallel process, and we're running at both of them.
What I would say is that now that we are on this revolutionary path to, looking at ourselves as biological systems, organisms, what comes with that, I think, is the realization that, if we are this biological system that can be manipulated or can be shaped the way that we wish, why should we not do it? It will become the normal way of thinking that, this is, you have this organism here, let's optimize it. And just look at the development from, say, 15 years ago, when you discussed cognitive enhancement. Philosophers would write articles about how that would be unethical.
Right.
Now they're writing about how should we make this the optimal thing to do for society.
Right.
It's no longer unethical, because we think of ourselves as biology.
And some of these things are moving faster than many even experts thought. Like years ago, I remember when cochlear implants became just on the horizon, and they happened a lot faster than most people expected. But also, our perspectives change dramatically, so much so it's often comical to look back in history. But we shouldn't be too judgmental. When the telephone first came out, there were people complaining that this is the end of social culture, because people will sit at home on the phone. Why would they ever leave the house?
Well, actually, Socrates was, against writing things down.
Right.
So,
and that didn't. Fortunately, he had a student who wasn't against it, or we wouldn't be talking about him today. So, Lona, speaking of enhancement, Elon Musk and another entrepreneur, Brian Johnson, have just invested a lot of money in the past year and a half in developing the class of technologies we refer to as invisible interfaces. So Neuralink and Kernel are seeking to connect computational systems, so the brain-computer interface, directly with the brain. No typing, no speaking. Any reflections on what this might mean if this becomes possible? And I think the science suggests that it could at some point. What does it mean?
Well, it's that's a big one. I mean, first I would say that if you talk to people who are actually doing computer-brain interfaces. They look at what Elon Musk is trying to do and sort of shake their heads and say they can't really imagine how this would in fact work, because they've been working a couple of decades on these interfaces, and it's really, really hard. It's very little you can do with them still. But imagining that you could have, it's basically a wild upgrade of your brain as a whole, right? It's like when people say now that, oh, we have a whole external brain in Google. This is actually having an external brain. And the thing is, I wonder.
My wife would say I need a wild upgrade to my brain.
Well, maybe, but I'm thinking about it. Where would the control come from? Would it be your brain, or would it be the other end of the interface? Yeah,
or another brain.
Yeah. That is I think, the bigger question to look at.
The network challenge becomes, and then the whole self question becomes even murkier and complicated.
Yeah.
So
you could have a distributed self.
Talk about that for a moment. And it's okay if we recognize we're wandering into science fiction at this point, but not altogether unbased in science.
Right. A lot of people talk about group intelligence. This could, in a way, be it, a sort of, swarm intelligence in a way, physically manifested with humans and machines. Because I imagine that if you have a wireless interface, an invisible interface, control might well come from the machine. Why not? And if you hack into a human brain, you probably would hack into the subconscious, right? And so instead of you having something served up by just your brain and what's in there and all the calculations that go on in the subconscious,
your cerebellum might be interacting with these systems, the other parts of your brain.
All the circuits in our brain that make up the unconscious. If that was the interface, you would have no idea whether it was you or somebody else thinking for you.
So you have set up one of my favorite questions, one again that won't be answered perhaps ever, and that is free will. If we do not necessarily have an identifiable, isolatable self, that questions the notion of free will. This notion of being part of a network, which we already are, our interface is a little different than what we're talking about. What's your perspective? What is science telling us about free will?
Well, I would say that I'm on the side of Sam Harris and others that would say we don't have free will. Certainly not in the old notion of you could choose whatever you wanted. If your brain is a physiochemical system, it can't go from one state to any other kind of state.
So does that mean you're actually saying that they're not altogether against free will? It's a path dependency.
No, I would say there isn't free will. What we feel is our free will is still what comes out of. It feels like it comes out of the blue, right? I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And it really comes from your unconscious. Your brain serves you up something after it has, played around with what are the possibilities here, what are my experiences, what should we probably do, this is what I want, I want coffee today, or whatever it is. And you just, the conscious you just feels that, oh, this is the conscious me that wants coffee.
Right.
So I can't see how we could have free will.
So is that the same as saying that we live in a deterministic universe?
No, I don't think that the two are the same. Because
how do you draw the distinction?
Well, if we imagine that there is some kind of uncertainty going on in certainly in the quantum world, so maybe also in at some levels in brain processes somewhere. So deterministic is not the same, that everything would unfold in a certain way. It's not the same, not necessarily the same as we don't have free will. It's just because, talk about you, for example, as a person. You could have different trajectories through your life, depending on what you run into, what happens to you, what you then decide.
Right.
It's all your unconscious that decides for you But as it is shaped along the way, you will have a different direction to go in. You will have different directions to go in.
Right.
And you will have, depending on what comes into your brain, stimuli from the outside, you will have different possibilities for your unconscious to make decisions. Different possibilities if you move in that direction or
right.
if you had moved in that direction.
Right. So it seems that maybe the notion of free will is not necessarily binary, we have it or we don't. Maybe there is a gray area and it's a definitional issue.
Well, I think, philosopher Patricia Churchland would say that we have degrees of will, degrees of free will. I'm not sure.
And Daniel Dennett's Freedom Evolves, I think he talks about these
but
issues.
I would still go with no free will.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, Lona, now I'd like to ask what is important to you. What's something that you've learned in this journey of science and life that you didn't expect?
I would say that I've really learned in my own life that knowing more about your biological machinery, knowing more about your brain function, your own personal genetics, actually makes a difference in your life.
In what ways? So knowing my genetics, knowing how my mechanisms work better and better over time, how does it make a difference in your life?
Because it makes you able to shape your life in more conscious ways, because you know about stuff that's going on. Let me give you actually the practical example.
Great.
I was diagnosed with depression first time when I was 30 or something. And what I felt was just, of course I'm depressed. The world is awful around me. I'm not, getting this and that. I'm not advancing in my job. Everything is, it's all on the outside. I have this epiphany when I am treated with, just basic antidepressive medication that, wow, my brain's state is now different. I feel kind of ecstatic. I feel actually quite happy. My circumstances have not changed at all.
Right.
So that set me on the journey of, looking at, if we know more about our brains, could we actually, treat ourselves differently? And then going into writing a book called Mindfield about, that also deals with, happiness research and where the happiness thermostat is actually installed in the brain, what cognitive technologies like meditation and mindfulness actually do to your brain and how it works. And then later going into writing a book called My Beautiful Genome, dealing with what are the genetic, underlying mechanisms of how your brain is set. And learning that I have all these very sensitive genetic variants that, make my brain more, you could call it sensitive to a lot of stimuli, and thus, give me a higher risk of depression. Well, just knowing this stuff and knowing what it means for my frontal cortex and how it's not very able to, suppress negative stimuli from the amygdala, that makes me able to think differently and to, in fact, quiet my amygdala down by thinking. It's using metacognition.
Because you're aware of the mechanism.
I'm aware of the mechanism,
work.
and that makes me think differently about myself. And that has actually created a huge difference in my own life.
So, Lona, I buy your premise that knowing more about how our biological mechanisms work can make us more effective and live better lives. But you have the blessing, you followed the blessing of spending a lot of time on these issues. Most people don't have that kind of time. They don't have the background that you have. What do you recommend for the public in general? What can help them benefit from this science?
Well, I would say that one of the best means to really, feel changes in yourself is meditation, mindfulness, if you do it, right, and if you do it in earnest. I'm not a Buddhist or, completely decouple it from any kind of religion or philosophy or whatever. But, look at it as a cognitive technology. And go and seek out what is there, what kind of information is there on what it does, and see what it can do for you.
So one path is meditation, and there does seem to be science that validates that there's real value.
Yeah.
What else?
Read fiction. Is what I'd say. I mean, that's...
Certainly read your books, right?
Well, that would be okay,
that would
but that's
be good.
nonfiction, though.
Right, yeah.
But I mean, I don't read much nonfiction outside of work. I mean, I read fiction. It's one of the greatest pleasures in my life, and it's a way of getting closer to human beings in a way that's just very pleasurable. I mean, you learn an awful lot about human thinking and human emotions and human relationships from just reading. And you learn in a different way than reading about these things in nonfiction science books.
It's interesting you say that, because some of the leaders that I've had the privilege to get to know in the world, one of the things I discover, maybe it's a self-selection process, but they often tend to be people who have their expertise, but they also do a lot of reading of fiction. Admiral Stavridis, who used to run NATO military, he spends a lot of time reading fiction and actually recommends it for the people that work with him. If you had the opportunity to integrate one superpower to your system, what would it be?
If it were just, for my own benefit, it would be being able to, enhance emotions.
Enhance emotions or control emotions?
Probably, I mean, if you had, perfect control of your emotions, I think life would become boring. It would become like taking soma, right?
Yeah.
But being able to enhance emotions, I think would be, and because, I mean, we have very few, let's say, really, deep experiences of, let's say, awe, for example. And when you run into those very deep emotions, being able to, enhance them or just prolong them a little bit, I think that would be amazing.
But it's unlikely that we could have a situation where we experience such emotions all the time.
Yeah.
Because then there's no contrast.
And that's what I say about being able to control them. No, that would make life boring in a way. But just, having a little more awe, not having it for 30 seconds, but maybe 5 minutes.
Great. Great. Lona, I ask that question fairly often, and you get a range of answers, some flippant, some serious. You chose one that is increasingly possible.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be.
Great.
With, for example, deep brain stimulation or other kind of interfaces with the brain.
You have a book coming out early next year called The Pleasure Shock.
Yeah.
How did you decide to follow this, the researcher Robert Heath at Tulane and his work with deep brain stimulation?
It was pure chance. I was writing a story several years ago for my newspaper about deep brain stimulation, which was sort of touted as this great new thing in Parkinson's disease. And I read this little note about somebody, and it's always touted as a new technology. Wow, there's this promising new technology, deep brain stimulation. I run into this little note on the web saying something about a Robert G. Heath who back in 1950 was stimulating people with, intrabrain electrodes. And I thought, wow. I couldn't find very much about him, but I thought that is really, a long time ago.
Assuming in the scientific literature there would have been articles that he published, etc.
Yeah, when you start to go back, and some of them are really difficult to find because this was before the internet, and but still on the web, just other articles about him are very, very few, and he looked like a scandalous researcher. He had tried to cure a homosexual in 1970. And I thought,
perhaps that impinges on people's perspective on his work.
It certainly does. And that is basically his legacy when you go out and look what's there. It's that he was this monster. And I thought, well, let's dig into that. I saw myself as finally I can be this, journalist who goes out, digs out a story, a story of controversy, and really, bring this to life. And what I find is the more I go into this man's story, I find some of his colleagues from back then. So I have this whole catalog of 90-year-old men that I travel around to see and speak to. And I read his original papers and so on. I find a completely different story. He was actually really, really, advanced. He was way before his time.
Which is probably part of the reason that he doesn't show up much.
I'm sure it is. And what he did was he bumped into the 70s when psychosurgery was, basically killed because of lobotomies and that whole controversy, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and so on and so forth. So he was, he sort of met a perfect storm of circumstances that made it impossible for him to really break through. But now, the funny thing is that now what he did, he tried to cure schizophrenia, depression, hyperaggression. All these kinds of things are coming back now, but people don't know about the story. And so when I tell researchers but do you know that this went on in the 50s and 60s, in fact, in New Orleans? No, never heard that.
And so what does his work and your story say about where we might be going?
I think it says that we might be going in a direction that wasn't possible when Robert Heath was working, because the brain was still a sacrosanct organ. And there was still a soul in there somewhere.
It was a holy relic of some sort.
Yes, you couldn't just manipulate it, right?
Yeah.
We have now come to a time and an era where manipulation is fine. It's okay with most people. So when we will see deep brain stimulation really, making a breakthrough, we will see people and surgeons using it for manipulating human minds in all sorts of ways. There's even, there are surgeons arguing that now that we know so much about how the brain deals with moral decision-making and morality, why not go out and use deep brain stimulation when people have moral pathologies? So if you have a pedophile, if you have a psychopath,
can you
whatever,
solve the problem?
Shouldn't we just solve the problem, is what some of these surgeons will actually write in papers.
Your story reminds me of the early days of neural nets and how they were buried by the canonical GOFI, the good old-fashioned artificial intelligence methodologies of symbolic manipulations. And now what have we seen in the past few years, perhaps past decade or so? Neural nets have risen again. Machine learning is becoming the path. And we're seeing this happen again. Perhaps the complexity of these topics are such that some of these things look crazy at the beginning. And also we have, as you mentioned, this moral framework that we're evolving out of. One of my good friends whom I respect very much in her perspective, the breadth of her perspective, is Esther Dyson. And Esther said something to me last month in an interview, that she is not a human patriot. And I had not heard that term before, I admit. Are you a human patriot?
Actually,
does it matter if we become a different species as a result of technology over the next 100 years or so?
No. We are a very, very young biological species. So even if we don't, combine with technology in any way, we will evolve into something different. Evolution hasn't stopped at all.
True, though it's much slower than the stuff that you're writing about.
Yeah, sure. But it's not that we are just a snapshot of a species right now. What would be the reason that we should be, kept as we are, like, an insect in amber? That would be strange. So technology I see as just another step in evolution, in fact. We evolved the ability to create culture. That made us really leap forward, right? Now we create technology, we can combine with technology, we can make even greater leaps. I think it's inevitable. And it is just evolution.
And the notion that we would keep ourselves the way we are today seems defeatist to me. It seems like we might as well just give up, and isn't that the purpose? One last question. Lona Frank's perspective on the future, in 3 words or less, hyphens are acceptable.
possibilities for betterment.
Possibilities for betterment. Perhaps the future ain't what it used to be.
Right.
Perhaps we're on a really interesting path, and I would say...
We could be. We have all the tools, in fact. The more that we understand about our own mechanisms and about human nature and where we evolved from, the more, and the limitations of, our way of being, the more we can transcend human nature. And I think that's possibly...
Transcend human nature,
yeah,
something
I think that's
we
possibly the best we can do.
Arguably have been in the midst of for maybe since the agricultural revolution, perhaps since the rise of Cro-Magnon man 200 or so thousand years ago.
Yeah.
Human nature itself changing. Is that what you suggest might happen in the next 100 years or so, in the next 3 billion seconds?
No, more that when we know about human nature, and we will know more and more, the more we can rise above it and say, our moral thinking is not perfect, but we will now use our very large frontal cortex and think more about our moral decision making and actually make better decisions, for example.
Lorna Frank, your perspective is optimistic and hopeful, and I think grounded in science, which gives me some hope. I hope that many people in the world who are experiencing anxiety and fear about where some of these technologies are going will read your work and understand its import. Revolutionary path we are on the rest of the century. Perhaps we have the opportunity for a wild upgrade to our brains and this crazy notion of group intelligence or group stupidity, as the case may be. Dismantling the self. When you were speaking, it caused me to reflect on the fact that we dismantled our position in the universe under Galileo, and perhaps we're doing this again. It's a concept that Moran Cerf talks a lot about, this notion that that our position in the universe shifted. We were no longer the center.
Sure.
And perhaps we recognize in the future that our self is no longer the center we thought it was. Meanwhile, we have no free will, but we can understand ourselves better and improve our lives and hopefully the lives of others. Lorna, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.